Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, college football edition. And ladies and gentlemen, the time has finally come. It is the official start of the college football regular season. All of that week 0 nonsense officially in the rearview mirror. I am your host on this magical mystery tour, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleagues and co-hosts, Brad Powers and Payne Insider. And Brad, we're going to get a plenty of opportunity today to hear Payne ramble on about what game we'll see unfold Sunday night between LSU and Florida State. So before we get into all of the games, and we have...
You're doing that
again.
100%
I'm doing that again, and I'm going to start right where I finished the last time the three of us were together, but I want to give Brad the floor, Payne, so if you could quiet down for a second. I want to come to Brad, who gave us a podcast entirely on his own last week for Week 0, and get some of his initial takeaways for the handful of games that we saw with the rule change and everything else, and then you can add your perspective shortly thereafter.
Yeah, I would have liked to given our loyal listeners a winner on a particular total across the pond in Ireland. But obviously, people are wanting to know what are my general thoughts on the rule changes, how much we think it impacts it. I would say right off the top, too small of a sample size. It was only 7 games. And look, I thought we were maybe a couple of bad breaks, a couple of missed field goals away from actually the overs cashing over the unders in that very small 7-game sample size. I don't think it's a great data point because none of the 14 teams playing last week were in the top 30 in terms of tempo. I want to see how it affects, generally speaking, all of college football. So I guess you'll be asking me the same question after this week.
We'll definitely come back to you on that. But Payne, now a follow-up question and or position that you want to take on this, given the observations that you saw from watching the games last weekend.
Well, we have a bunch of new listeners, and I just don't like you positioning me as the Florida State guy. That was all.
Oh.
Nothing less, nothing more.
They should have listened to the ACC.
I prefer to talk less on this podcast. They should have listened to the ACC
preview.
You guys are the college guys. Yeah, well, I mean, that is, I got to say, and this is, people come for the Florida goods because for whatever reason, the ACC preview continues to be the most listened to one. Not saying anything. Okay.
Brad, you like the veiled shots at you and I? He doesn't go, yeah, you know what? The Conference USA preview you and Todd did back in May is the most listened to show in Bet the Board podcast recorded history.
Well, they did have the longest runway, but I thought they were awesome. You got my vote of confidence there, and people did love them. More content, the better. And I think you kind of positioned last week as like you and I decided not to show up for the intro podcast of the season. The reality is we've never done a Week 0 podcast. We gave the listeners more than what they wanted, and Brad delivered.
Well, look, when you have a 5-star recruit and it's Week 1, you allow him to go out there and run the pass-happy offense. I'm not going to keep him in the stable. So Brad had a chance to get his sea legs under him. He got a chance to talk about Notre Dame. He knows that we're disappointed he didn't make the trip to go watch his beloved Irish in Ireland, but that's a different discussion for a different day entirely. So, Payne, what were your thoughts on the rule changes?
we saw the numbers that got released, and I think to Brad's point, it was a very small sample size, 7 games. But the percentage was what, 8% reduction in plays. The problem was it only resulted in 3 less minutes of actual game time. So this will shock some people, but big business decided to do a big business thing and take away something we love, which is more football, so they could make more money and jam commercials down our throat. That was my takeaway from this. I think specific to the rule change, all of the estimations that came before the season on snap reduction is interesting. I think the rule change maybe is the tip of the iceberg. Basically, in every walk of life, when a brand new rule is introduced, right, it takes time to figure out how to use that rule change to your advantage, how to exaggerate that rule. And my immediate thought is any team that's a 10-point dog or greater, if you're not snapping the ball with 1 second left on the play clock, you're damn fools. And so
good point.
I wonder if in those games the snap reduction's greater than the 8% that we saw, right, relative to like some of these teams with double-digit spreads. That would be my initial instinct there. If you're a coach with a pulse and you are a large dog, like, your entire goal is to shorten that thing. The clock should be one every single time you snap it.
Do we think Jimbo Fisher's going into the offensive coordinator room with Bobby Petrino going, all right, Bobby,
listen,
my
we all
goal
have an
here is to run
over-ticket there. Let's not put that into the universe.
My goal is to run 34 plays a game now and can go even slower than what we've seen in College Station the last handful of years.
Yeah, that's not fun. That's not fun. We all have an over ticket there on the win total. Let's not put that into the
Look,
universe.
they can win every game 17-13 and be just fine behind a very talented defense. But no, it's something that we'll obviously follow, guys, as we have more and more data points. Wanted to get your take right off the top. One last thing, Brad, because we'll get into Utah, Florida, and for those listeners new to Bet the Board listening for the first time, we'll run through these games not in chronological order, but in rotation order. Did you see anything from the Irish that you particularly liked or didn't like in the Sam Hartman debut?
Well, obviously, Sam Hartman would be the biggest takeaway, and we've said this. They have not had a quarterback of that ability going back to Jimmy Clausen and Brady Quinn, and that's been more than a decade ago. So he was as good as advertised. I would say, just generally speaking, operationally, I was impressed, especially with a new, a lot of new faces, particularly on the offensive coaching staff. New offense coordinator, doesn't have much experience. New quarterbacks coach, and you didn't see Notre Dame with the issues as far as delay of game penalties, false start penalties. Very clean performance by the Irish, something we didn't see from a lot of the other teams on week 0.
No, it's a fair assessment, no doubt about it. They took advantage of a Navy team that looked ill-equipped to slow them down with anything they were doing offensively. Of course, the Irish will get a much better indication of where this team is when they travel to Carter Finley Stadium in 2 weeks, not this week when they take on Tennessee State, and of course the big showdown against Ohio State. But no, it's a team you follow closely. We obviously would have hoped that we had a field goal for Navy and Notre Dame to make things a little better there. But all right, gentlemen, on to week 1 we go, and a fascinating matchup in Salt Lake City on Thursday night for all the wrong reasons. With Utah, we'll call right now a 4.5 to 5 point favorite, total all the way down to 44. And this game isn't as much about the X's and O's and everything else that we're going to see unfold tonight. It's about the market and the way it continues to read, react, and respond to the uncertain quarterback situation unfolding for Kyle Whittingham's bunch. But before we get into all of that, Brad, I want to come to you first on this game. If all things were equal and Cam Rising came into this spot, albeit a bit limited, knowing that he had torn the ACL in the Rose Bowl there, did you feel that this side in total from an opening standpoint in that 9.5, 10 range and a total as high as I believe 54.5 at a couple of shops early was a little bit aggressive and ambitious, even if he was named the starter at the beginning of fall camp?
Nah, if he was perfectly healthy, had no injury history or issues, I thought that line would have been fair. I think Utah's just as good as, on paper as what they've been the last couple of years. Florida, it's some major question marks. So, I mean, keep in mind, Utah was a road favorite in the Swamp last year, right around 3 points. So, even though they fell short of expectations there, I thought it was a fair opening number. If he was 100% healthy, it wasn't a fair number because there were legitimate issues had anyone been paying attention in the offseason, whether or not Rising was going to be even ready for this game. On top of their best receiving weapon, Brant Keithy, who had a big performance against Florida last year. I just can't, but with him also out, I can't believe that I guess I can. I do bet this stuff. I can't believe that they weren't on top of it. I guess what I'm getting to is, and I mentioned this in the SEC podcast, Payne and I were sitting at dinner early May. Mr. Renaissance, man, with all these things going on in his life, and he doesn't follow college football, was talking to me on how he wanted to bet the under in this Florida-Utah game. How does Payne have it figured out and these bookmakers don't? So the total was high to begin with, even if Rising wasn't.
Well, I mean, Brad, Payne did tell us at the top of the show he is Mr. Know-It-All for all things in the state of Florida when it comes to college football. So he said that's why they come for the goods. So that's clearly why he was in tune exactly with where this game opened up. But Payne, as we look through this, and then I'll get to laying out some of the storylines that we're following in this contest. Obviously, Kyle Whittingham has done this before. We saw last year in Pullman, Washington, Utah didn't announce their starting quarterback till 10 minutes before. Bryson Barnes didn't even take warm-ups with the first team. He goes out there and performs okay. Didn't set the world on fire by any stretch of the imagination, but clearly, Utah has an idea of who their starting quarterback is going to be. They no doubt have been working on that for 3 weeks leading up to it. Have you been surprised with the way information leaks, with Cam Rising being named atop the depth chart? Market goes to 7, then speculation that he's not going to be out there. We see the market start to drop. And in the last 36 hours or so, we're starting to see a little bit of Utah enter, maybe as much of the public as anything else, trying to bet the marquee game of opening night.
Yeah, you did see just this morning Utah got to 6 at Chris, and then it was quickly taken away. The entire game, to your point, is about the moving parts, is about the injuries, and we saw the speculation ramp up over the last 24 hours or so. Our good buddy Brad was taking some shots at Pete Thamel. Pete comes out and it was like Cam Rising is doubtful and not expected to play. That hasn't officially hit the screen yet. And, Brad hit it perfectly. If you even go back to our Pac-12 preview, we all but spelled that out for you. And then unprovoked, Brad gave me a little pat on the back there about that dinner in May. I can tell you if Cam Rising's the moon, Pete Thamel wasn't the first man to land on it. So I think this has been out there for a while. I am very surprised, though, that Utah let the media get a hold of this. And I think you mentioned the very similar situation against Wazoo last season where Cam Rising was questionable. He's in uniform. He goes through warm-up. Kyle Whittingham doesn't tell anybody, and he doesn't play. FS1 had the game, and I can tell you they were pissed about it. The broadcasters were irate. I thought that's exactly how this would play out. Even Kyle Whittingham joked in a presser last week saying, 10 minutes before kickoff, people will know. And then Rising doubled down this week and said maybe even 7 minutes. So I was a little surprised that it got out this way, even though most people that really, truly bet this stuff had the information a long time ago. And I think in this situation, as a rule of thumb, especially, the first week of the season, you're probably having the advantage of all summer to create 3 numbers for a game like this, right? The 100% healthy Cam Rising number, the Cam Rising number where he's not a factor as a runner because he's 8 months removed from ACL, and then the third number, which is Bryson Barnes and then Nate Johnson playing. I'm a little different than you on this, Todd. I mean, Barnes has experience. Right? I mean, he's been in this system since 2020. He knows Andy Ludwig inside and out, and the kid was thrown into the fire against Ohio State in the Rose Bowl, and he led the Utes to a 57-yard touchdown drive with under 5 minutes to go. He started the...
and we needed every one of those points
Wazoo
sitting
game
on Utah against Ohio State. We needed every one of those points because the defense sure as hell wasn't getting stops.
Yeah, well, they're playing running back against Smith and Jigba. I mean, it was very difficult, right? I mean, we're watching Bernard out there try to
probably not the best recipe for success, no.
But then Barnes played again in the Rose Bowl last year against Penn State. So those are some very big games, very tough environments. It's going to be a little bit easier at home for him. The sample size isn't large, but if you look at Bryson Barnes' stable metrics, like throwing from a clean pocket, he was virtually identical to Cam Rising last year. And then again in the presser, like, you are going to see Nate Johnson in this game no matter what. And I thought Brad did a great job bringing up Brant Kuthi because he was vital in this matchup last year at Florida. And, having your stud tight end out is not a positive. Again, this has not officially hit the screen. And so that's what I think is interesting about this game is where does it go from here? And it's not just Utah. Like, Florida's not in great shape. Like, Justice Boone tore his ACL. Starting defensive tackle Chris McClellan is questionable. The starting center, Kingsley, also a game-time decision. And then what I said at the top about the moving parts, like, Florida's schedule's been disrupted.
Yep.
Their travel plans completely changed due to the hurricane. They left before the storm got there. Florida flew into Dallas on Tuesday, got a practice in, and then they left from Dallas to Salt Lake. And if you've read some of the underlying stuff, there's like Napier was concerned about this to the point where he reached out to his sports science team, reached out to NFL organizations to figure out the best travel plans and also how to deal with going from extreme heat and humidity to altitude in Utah. And so there's some negative stuff here for Florida as well. This to me again, right? Just information and market and not necessarily the matchups. We could break those down. But I just feel like if you took plus 10 early in the summer, awesome bet. Got anything above 7.5, it makes a world of sense. But I think, I'll just be candid. What I'm hearing is once Rising and Kuthi officially get announced out on the screen, this number is going to dip a little bit further, and I can tell you there'll probably be some buy orders on Utah at the best money line price that you can find, with the belief that Bryson Barnes knows the system well enough, that Nate Johnson provides a great wrinkle, and laying a cheap price against a Florida team projected to win 5 games in a very unfamiliar environment might be too good to pass.
Well, there's a lot of continuity as well for Utah, and I'll give the Utah players credit. They haven't shied away from saying that this is going to be a revenge game for them. It's one where they weren't prepared last year for some of the physicality. They've changed the dynamics in their practice leading up to it. And you mentioned Billy Napier calling around trying to get advice on what it's like to play at altitude. Billy Napier may have needed to call around to figure out what it's like for the University of Florida to leave the state for a non-conference game, because that doesn't happen all that often. And I was blown away by the stat that I saw out there in one of the Utah newspapers in the Deseret News. You have to go back to 1991 for the Gators' last true road non-conference clash outside the state of Florida. It was a 38-21 loss to Syracuse at the Carrier Dome way back when. They've only played a true road opener 3 times over the last 3 decades. So this is a little bit of uncharted territory when we talk about SEC football and such. And Payne, I know this is near and dear to you because this is exactly how Syracuse basketball used to set things up under Jim Boeheim, where they had to beat up on Binghamton and Cornell before they ever wanted to play anybody with a real pulse. In the heyday, the Utes are calling this the biggest home opener since Michigan came to Salt Lake City in 2015. Payne, you mentioned the travel itinerary. And when we look at Utah, I mean, this is a team that's dominated Rice-Eccles Stadium. 28-0 in non-conference home games going back to 2007. The last loss came against Boise State. And when you look at their point per game differential, I know there are a lot of Weber States and some FCS opponents mixed in there, but they have taken the hammer out when given the opportunity, because this is one of the more difficult venues to play in west of the Mississippi that I don't think the casual college football fan gives credence to. But Brad, Payne brought up the quarterback situation and obviously having ample time to prepare for all of this, but Utah brings back a bevy of experience in the trenches, which can also be a massive advantage against a Florida team that has a lot of questions they'll have to answer, not just in their in their season opener, but throughout the course of non-conference play.
Yeah, one of the best friends for a relatively inexperienced quarterback can be a rush attack that I expect to have some success in this game. Why not? It had success last year against Florida. I think the name you need to know is Jaquindon Jackson, the running back. Big kid, 6'2", 228. Really started to flash at the end of last season, starting with that game that Bryson Barnes started at Washington State last year. Jackson averaged 7.7 yards per attempt from that Washington State game on through the rest of the season. So I think he actually could be not only a breakout player for this game, breakout player in all of college football this year, might end up being one of the best running backs in the Pac-12. They still have plenty of experience even behind him. Micah Bernard is playing his preferred position, running back, and not defensive back, chasing around Smith and Jigba like what you guys mentioned. The wide receivers are okay for Utah. I mean, I would Keithy's worked something to the line because I'm not wild about the wide receivers. But up front, Whittingham loves the offensive line. He says it's the most talented group he's had there, has depth. I will say I don't see a lot of – there's experience. I'm not sure there's a lot of first-team All-Pac-12 type caliber players on it, but it should be solid and should have an edge over a Florida defensive line that has some question marks.
Payne, on the other side, you ready to start the Graham Mertz Heisman campaign tonight if he goes out there, throws for 300 yards and 6 touchdowns?
Well, the first thing is, and I don't know if Brad remembers this, but Todd certainly didn't. That game you referenced for Florida in 1991, that was my first college football game ever. Went to it. Was in the building for that. And so the opening kickoff was an end around touchdown for Syracuse.
Wait, you went back and
I was in the building for that game. Very first college football game I ever attended was the one you referenced there. I think specific to this game, it sounds old school, But both teams have questions at quarterback, right? And it's calmed down in the last 36 hours if you're following this, but there was a dash of wind. And right now it's like 16 miles per hour. There's gusts into the 30s. But I just think this gets back to old school football, right? Like Utah's defense was outside the top 75 in line yards allowed last season. The number is worse if Bo Nix and Caleb Williams weren't hampered by injuries. The Gators defense outside the top 80 in defensive line yards. The makeup of Kyle Whittingham and Billy Napier both want to be physical and understand this game's going to be won on the ground. And I think the variance is then which QB limits the mistakes, which one connects on the explosive shot or two, and inevitably both defenses are being aggressive with box counts. I mean, you listen to Austin Armstrong, I know a guy that Brad loves and we're pretty familiar with. Like his catchphrase is, we negotiate with a hammer. So Florida's going to use that creeper, a fifth man on the line against the run, and ultimately, you're going to have Bryson hopefully hit a deep shot or two here. But that's what this game's going to come down to, very much who dominates the line of scrimmage, because both of those units pride themselves on being able to run the football. To Brad's point, a lot of returning experience up front for Utah. They are mixing in the freshman Spencer Fano. He's a true freshman left tackle, highest rated O-lineman in Utah history. So it'll be interesting to see what Austin Armstrong comes up with there in some blitz packages to focus on the freshmen there. But again, for me, all about price here and ultimately who's going to be able to win the ground and pound game, because that's what it's going to look like, and that's what the market's telling you it's going to look like.
An interesting game, especially when you watch the number continue to move up till kickoff. We've obviously seen a lot of volatility, both side and total, amid speculation about who will be and who won't be available for both of these sides to kick things off on opening night. From Thursday into Saturday, gentlemen, and Payne, this is the perfect opportunity for you if you need to fill up your water right now, as we're going to get Brad's take on a non-Power 5 matchup, albeit one that has one of the top-ranked teams in the land, Michigan, welcoming in East Carolina. Michigan, more than a 5-touchdown favorite in this spot. The total sits in the low 50s. And Brad, all the talk around Michigan isn't just J.J. McCarthy and his legitimate shot to win the Heisman Trophy, but Michigan being able to get over the hump in the college football playoff and make an actual run to a national title. But they're going to do it without their man in charge in Coach Harbaugh. A very soft landing spot, going to miss 3 non-conference games against a true murderer's row of ECU, Bowling Green, and UNLV. So kudos to Michigan for really coming down hard on Jim Harbaugh for some of those situations. But when you look at this game, this ECU roster going to look a little bit different. Holton Ahlers felt like he was there for 37 years leading the charge offensively. We've seen Keaton Mitchell flash during the NFL preseason as a member of the Baltimore Ravens, but they seem to be high in Greenville around starting quarterback Mason Garcia and some of the receivers he has there. When you look at a game like this, we've seen Michigan really feast on cupcakes in the past. Do you think there's a downgrade to Sherrone Moore, who's going to be the head man in charge on game day, or what are kind of the expectations that we should see when Michigan kicks off their schedule against the non-conference foe?
What you just said is why I think there's value. Believe it or not, Sherrone Moore is not playing, not coaching in this game either. So I don't think Harbaugh's absence moves the line at all. But when you take the combination of Harbaugh and Sherrone Moore missing this game, and Sherrone Moore also not only the offensive coordinator but the offensive line coach, that's all of a sudden where you get a 1 + 1 = 3 situation as far as I'm concerned. So you're going to get an analyst promoted. They haven't officially announced it yet to the offensive coordinator role. So a lot of question marks. Sherrone Moore, just 1 game suspension. He'll be back. He actually has been named the head coach for the Week 3 game, I believe.
See, this is what happens, Brad. This is why we have you to correct me when I might write things down incorrectly notes-wise. So, I appreciate that, because I thought Moore was coaching this game. Knew he was suspended. I just didn't think it was Week 1, so appreciate that.
Yeah, so I think that's some of the reason why I think there's some value, because there's so much uncertainty with this whole situation. Harbaugh suspended, he's not suspended, then he's suspended again, and we haven't seen the market move too much. But more specific, not only is the absences, but for me, this is one where the new clock rules, I think, can be advantageous or disadvantageous for Michigan's sake, because you're dealing with a Michigan program that doesn't run a lot of tempo. Average at best as far as tempo, below average if you take a multiple last 3-year sample size for them. And on top of it, they like to run the football, run first. I think the run first teams will be more greatly impacted by the clock rules as far as the clock continuing. There's no out of bounds situations as much as a throw game would be. So that's a couple reasons why I want to be more on the take instead of laying it here. And then finally, everyone's going to talk about the lack of returning production and experience for East Carolina. I'm here to tell you, in the transfer portal era, I don't think it means as much as far as returning starters, experience. East Carolina brings in 17 transfers. That's a lot, obviously. And look no further than the offensive line. I mean, typically I would be so down on this offensive line because they lose 4 starters, multiple-year starters. But yet you look on the roster and they have 80 career starts. They have more career starts coming into this season than what they did last season for East Carolina. So now I also look at how they've done recruiting the last couple of years, as good as any team in the American. So you mentioned Mason Garcia. I actually watched him start a game 3 years ago against Navy. I like this kid. He's been in the program, 6'5", 240, big kid, strong arm. And I think if they were smart, and I do think Mike Houston is above average in that ability, they're going to run the football, they're going to work the clock, and I just think with the clock running, an early start time, no Harbaugh, no OC, 36 is way too much to lay here. Give me East Carolina plus 36.
I think these are the kind of perfect spots, as you highlighted, Brad. We're going to get a much better indication of what it's like to lay big numbers with teams that want to establish the run early on, and how we'll see these games get shortened, how many fewer plays they'll have. And Michigan, I can't imagine, suddenly wants to run an air raid offense with J.J. McCarthy, even if he is going to be very much, at least early on in the Heisman discussion, before Michigan starts their regular season schedule with Rutgers midway through September. From there, guys, the Saturday night game on ABC will have a battle of North and South, and the pair of Carolinas will do battle here. When we look at North Carolina and South Carolina, it's UNC, a 2.5-point favorite for a game taking place in Charlotte. Total on the game, 64.5. 10th meeting between these programs since 1988. And when you look at Mac Brown, fresh off the most wins of any season while he's been at the helm in Chapel Hill, but clearly this is a North Carolina team with a Heisman frontrunner in their own right in Drake May that's going to define the season with an ACC title if they can get there, something that the program hasn't been able to accomplish since 1980. And Mac Brown wasn't shy, saying we're jumping in with both feet. We've got a great challenge in South Carolina. They had a lot of momentum at the end of the season. Mentioned the potential, Payne, for multiple offensive game plans as UNC awaits the status of Tez Walker. Will he or won't he be available as they go through the waiver process? A change in offensive coordinator with Chip Lindsey taking over Phil Longo, who brought his offensive style to Wisconsin to run the OC opposite Luke Fickell. So when you look at a game like this, South Carolina comes into this season with a ton of momentum. The recruiting from Shane Beamer, a lot of high-profile recruits, but there were a number of defections that you guys highlighted when we broke down the Gamecocks in our SEC preview. But Spencer Rattler, the common denominator here, and a man you're too familiar with, as all NFL fans are, in Dole Loggins leading the offensive charge.
You mentioned the momentum, and I just, that momentum and the SEC brand, I thought would have had you land a better OC. Right? There's a real opportunity to go out there and get an elite offensive mind. And you just didn't do it. I think it was a total whiff. And, you know, we talked on it on the podcast with Dowell Loggins coordinating the Bears, Dolphins, and Jets offenses for multiple seasons, 28th, 26th, 31st, 32nd. That's where his offense is finished in schedule adjusted efficiency. When I go through South Carolina's offensive roster, to me, it's bleak. And I think Spencer Rattler has to find a level of play that we haven't seen yet to elevate what's around him. You look at the best parts of South Carolina's offense last season, they were the unstable metrics, right? The ones that come with variance. The only thing that really kept this offense from being a total disaster was explosive plays and fantastic green zone conversion rate, both of which were top 25 in the country. And I just don't know if a change in OC is going to immediately improve things. What I'm hearing internally is it's not just, you know, the OC handling things. It's going to be a group effort this year. We'll see. I know North Carolina's defense has been a total disaster outside the top 90 in every meaningful and stable metric, but there, I think, is reason to believe the unit improves slightly. And I don't know if South Carolina's offense is the one that can take advantage of a horrific defense like this to actually exceed the expectations. I'm a little worried, and I think we have been, about South Carolina's offensive line as well. I mean, we pointed it out, discussed it in full detail on our SEC preview. The production that returns is below replacement level. The transfers that came in were from lower levels and weren't great against G5 and FCS competition. And so I just don't see a ton up front. And, we know Spencer Rattler is extremely sensitive to pressure. Fourth highest turnover-worthy play rate among Power 5 quarterbacks with at least 400 dropbacks last season. I don't see that offensive line improving much. The weapons, that's where you got to take advantage of North Carolina, right? Through the air. Certainly the Tar Heel secondary is revamped. On paper, it's improved, but I don't really see a ton here, I think the most dynamic playmaker South Carolina's offense has are Juice Wells and then the 5-star freshman, right, Nick Harbor. Juice had a lower body injury, returned to practice in a limited fashion last week. Harbor was back at practice on Tuesday. So are they going to be 100%? The vibe I get is no. And then you have a lead running back and Dakereon Joyner, who switched from wide receiver this year. So to me, it's tough to fathom the Tar Heels defense being worse than last season. Our projection has them getting to, I wouldn't say anywhere near average, but somewhere between like bad and, below average. And what I see on offense for South Carolina, I'm not sure that leads to an effort that completely exceeds expectations.
Yeah, you mentioned UNC's defense, and if you look at some of the counting stats, they ranked last in the ACC in a handful of things last year. Points per game, nearly 31 a contest. Total yards per game, 436.5. Yards per play, 6.1, and they only accumulated 17 sacks. The big buzz through camp from Gene Chizik has been violence and speed is what this group wants to try and go about accomplishing. I guess if there's a relative strength, maybe you say it's the defensive line, but they do bring back the tandem at linebacker that had nearly 250 tackles in Cedric Gray and Power Nichols. We'll see if they can generate pressure for a young defensive backfield. Brad, when you look at North Carolina offensive, we know about Drake May. He's a headliner. He's going to play on Sundays. There's no reason to have questions there. But this was also a UNC team that started last year white hot and really limped to the finish because the offensive line couldn't protect him. The weapons right now on paper, especially if Tez Walker isn't available, nowhere near the caliber that what we saw last year with Josh Downs and Antoine Green essentially the go-to punch. Could we see a North Carolina group that leans a little bit more on the run early, even with a very decorated quarterback under center?
Yeah, I think that is going to be the case in this situation because all spring and most of the summer, the expectation was Tez Walker, the transfer from Kent State, we're not going to miss a beat at wide receiver because he's going to be our alpha. And then all of a sudden, that eligibility denied by the NCAA. Late in the process, something they didn't expect and obviously something they're still fighting. But everything that I've read so far through camp, and kudos to Payne for putting me onto this, is they're going to use multitude of running backs. It looks like British Brooks is going to get the start, but Elijah Green will be in the mix there. I also thought it was intriguing when you look at the tight end position. Even though they had some more highly productive guys coming back, Copenhaver is going to start at tight end, but I'm expecting to see multiple tight end looks, especially with an absence of a Tez Walker at wide receiver. So I think when you look at the matchup, and North Carolina is very experienced up front, with 4 starters back, all fifth-year seniors. Talent level and production level as far as replacement level, I'm not sure. Again, similar to Utah's offensive line, I don't see a lot of first-team All-ACC caliber players. The Willie Lampkin kid from Coastal Carolina, 3-time All-Sun Belt, looks like he's going to take a starting position. They do have a new offensive line coach, so that gives me a little bit of optimism. But what gives me optimism is I don't think South Carolina's defensive front's that good. Except when they're playing the South Carolina offensive line in the spring game. But other than that, I think that this North Carolina offensive front can have success. And with question marks at wide receiver and more answers at running back and tight end, I think we see something that's not something that we've seen from North Carolina the last couple of years. I don't see a lot of tempo here. I see probably a little bit more pro-style type of offense.
It's so interesting because you obviously have seen what Chip Lindsey was able to accomplish as OC at UCF, but Gus wanted to run significantly faster. Chip wanted to go out there and play a little bit more physical. It was a team that could run the football, and with the new clock rules, you would think 3 to 4 yards in a cloud of dust might be exactly what UNC wants. And even on the flip side, if South Carolina becomes a pass funnel offense of sorts, I mean, this is a group that may want to protect its defensive shortcomings as well, knowing that this is a Gamecocks team last year whose secondary was the strength, relatively speaking, because, Brad, most teams didn't have to throw on South Carolina, knowing that you, me, and a couple of our local contributors at the YMCA might be able to run the football consistently against that South Carolina defensive line.
Yeah, I mean, even with the uptick as far as the performance, the big upset against Tennessee, the upset over Clemson, a good effort against Notre Dame as far as the scoreboard, was not a good effort as far as basic counting stats in the rush defense department. 251 rush yards per game allowed their last 5 games. Again, that's why I think North Carolina's thought process has to be, we can go out there and hammer away at this South Carolina defensive front. That, you know, as bad as they were a year ago, they also lost their best players up front. Pickens' kid gets drafted in the 3rd round. Gilbert Edmond transfers to Florida State. Their best pass rusher up front transfers to Birch transfers to Oregon. So weren't good last year, even with some talented players, and now those talented players are gone.
Payne, when you look at the market on this game, we know the total opened a little bit lower. I mean, at 61.5, looked like it was dummied down at some prominent shops into the high 50s, and now sits at 64.5. This will be one of the marquee games of the day, probably one of 2 outside of Florida State LSU, garnering as much national attention as any other that we'll see. Have you seen anything on the side from your variety of contacts where the numbers sit pretty much painted at 2.5? Appears every time it gets to 3, though, there is a little bit of an appetite for the dog.
I have not necessarily heard anything at the current price. You are very astute in that when it gets to 3, there's a little bit of some buy. It's not for me, but I think it's everything that you guys mentioned, and ultimately, you know, what happens with Tez Walker.
Yep.
It's very obvious the NCAA screwed the pooch there. Let's see if they fix it. I know UNC's still waiting word about that. The total to me is what's interesting, just based upon how we've broken this game down. I think, you know, we know what Drake May is, right? He's going to be a top 2 pick in April, but he really propped this offense up. Highest usage rate of any quarterback in the country, turned it into being, you know, number 1 in EPA per play among Power 5 quarterbacks. But all of a sudden, you know, there's this emphasis on running the ball. So while that might be the matchup advantage here, it concerns me because you're taking the ball out of Drake May's hands, who's like a cheat code to efficiency, so we can run it with a group that was outside the top 70 in EPA per rush. And so that's what makes the total interesting, is that Brad's like hit it perfectly on North Carolina's offensive line. A lot of dudes returning, veterans, lots of middling to below replacement level play from those vets. I mean, again, where's Zach Rice? He was the number 1 offensive tackle recruit, early enrollee his freshman year. 20 months of development under Mac Brown, and Rice has turned into a solid 3rd-string right guard. You know, I mean, jokes aside, the battle up front is key. It has some variance because the Gamecocks don't have a good defensive line on paper, and you know, they were able to surrender some yards last year, but they did do a good job limiting the explosive stuff. So I think that is probably the path here for North Carolina, just when you look at South Carolina's defense being bottom 10 in yards before contact allowed. Brought in a few guys, but, I mean, it's very much which one of those weak units steps up here. And I think if you're looking to do something, this is probably a sneaky total, right? Like 4-yard runs are good enough to keep calling, but it also moves the clock. So I think this is a very interesting total to see where this potentially moves here over the next, you know, day or two.
No doubt about it. A game that obviously all the college football world will be tuned into on Saturday night. Want to remind all of you, our loyal Bet the Board listeners, you can follow your favorite Bet the Board personalities on social media at Brad Power 7. You can follow Payne at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. And most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And we'll continue to remind you until we're blue in the face. If you haven't already subscribed to the Bet the Board newsletter, it now is the perfect time to do so. It's absolutely absolutely free every Friday throughout the fall. If you happen to miss some of our great content throughout the week, it is the perfect reminder, along with additional best bet content that we add on to what you're going to get throughout the course of the week on these very podcasts. TCU Colorado, gentlemen, a game that is creating all sorts of buzz for Deion Sanders' debut in Boulder. And when we look at this game, I mean, the number, it's massive. TCU right around a 3-touchdown favorite, 20.5. The total has ticked up a touch from where it was 59.5 earlier in the week with a very influential betting group, although there's been a little bit of buyback when the number does get as high as 64. Colorado's offensive line being called the worst position group on the team. We've seen some prominent ESPN personalities call out Colorado. And Brad, I know you've led the charge initially for the way Colorado was overvalued in the market. You got out ahead of it on the win total and some of the other prices. But I was stunned that Tom Luginbill comes out and says this is the worst roster in the FBS. I feel like we've jumped the shark a little bit in terms of throwing Deion Sanders and company completely under the bus, knowing the level that they've been able to recruit both incoming talent through the transfer portal and some of the undergraduate contingent.
Yeah, I didn't like the comment at all because I vehemently disagree with it. Look, I still think it's a bad roster. I still think it's a roster that I'm very concerned if they have any injury issues and they get beyond the starting 22. But as far as the starting 22 goes, I think it's better than several at the Power 5 level. So for him to say that, just out of ignorance, a guy that's a recruiting guy too, I just can't believe that he would say something like that. This game to me, obviously high variance because of all the transfers for Colorado, tough pricing it. I do agree with that sharp betting group as far as what I've seen so far in practice, and that's been the good thing. We mentioned this in the Pac-12 preview. The beauty of it is they have pulled the curtain totally off the railing, and we've gotten a total view of what this program's been this offseason as far as unlimited, it seems like, practice viewing, scrimmaging, looking at the plays. And what I've seen is a Colorado offense that's looked pretty efficient. Especially Shedeur Sanders, I think, has been the biggest surprise to me. He looks extremely competent. The pass game, Dylan Edwards, I think, is going to be their breakout running back, even though they bring in McCaskill and Smoke as a transfer. I like the kid that they flipped from Notre Dame. He's a jitterbug. He's not going to be able to give him 25 carries a game, but I think he can give him a couple of explosives in each and every game. But I think, as you said, offensive line worries me a little bit, and defensive secondary also worries me. Even with Travis Hunter and Cormani McLean with what they're deeming lockdown corners, I'm really worried about the safety position. So far the market, even though we've seen almost a lot of money come in on the unders and almost across the board, from what I've seen, it makes sense to me, but completely high, too high variance for me to get really too much involved.
Payne, I'll come to you in a second when we talk about how we think Colorado's offensive line can match up against the TCU defensive front. But before we do that, Brad, I want to kind of pinball back to you real quick. When you look at these two teams compared to where they finished last year, I know when we did our preseason preview for the Pac-12, although Colorado obviously making the move to the Big 12, so this will be a conference rival, you said it may be one of the most improved teams in the country. Now, granted, the floor wasn't exactly high when you dig into some of Colorado's numbers over the years. 48-94 straight up over the last 12 seasons, 27-78 versus Pac-12 opponents, the second most losses versus conference opponents in the FBS since 2011. And clearly, when you dig into where they ranked in a lot of categories, they were 130th or worse in the following: points margin, average margin of defeat, points off turnover margin, total yards margin, points per game allowed, rushing yards per game allowed, yards per game allowed, yards per play allowed, sacks, and third downs. How much have you upgraded Colorado? And on the flip side, what have you done with TCU in the wake of them performing at a runner-up status last year against Georgia?
So I think it's important to note that a lot of the pros, it's not like we're not taking into consideration the upgrade in talent that Colorado and Deion's brought in here. It's just the fact, like you mentioned, this was not only the worst Power 5 team in the country last year, it was historically bad. As far as just scoring margin in the last 30 years, 4th worst out of any Power 5 team in 30 years. So there's a lot of room for an improvement. And even though I've upgraded Colorado more than any team in the country, 11 plus points as far as my power ratings, they're still obviously one of the worst Power 5 teams in the country. Upgrade for them, obviously downgrade for TCU, particularly on the offensive side of the ball, about a 3-point overall downgrade for them as a team. So, I mean, you can do the math there. My power ratings say this game should be right around 21, which is where the spread is. Upgrade Colorado 11 from the end of the season, downgrade TCU 3. I mean, at the end of last season, this is a 35-point spread.
Yeah, I was going to say, the way those two teams were trending last year, we saw Chandler Morris struggle early against Colorado before it was Max Duggan that came in, took over, and TCU was able to put some separation between them and the Buffaloes in a game at Folsom Field. But Payne, offensive line-wise, I mean, Colorado still trying to improve this position group. There's not a ton of depth, and early in the season, depth may not sound like a big deal, but when kickoff temperatures are forecasted to be 95 to 100 degrees, clearly these big fellows are going to get a lot of reps, or TCU's defensive line is going to feast coming after Shedeur Sanders leading that Sean Lewis high-tempo offense.
That's actually what I'm looking most forward to, is that, Sean Lewis, Joe Gillespie battle. I mean, they're just very innovative systems, two modern minds, and you look at what Lewis wants you to do, it's cover every blade of grass. So you're going to see Colorado receivers lined up outside the numbers. It's very Bryles-esque. There's lots of pre-snap motion. Every play Sean Lewis calls has multiple options attached to it, so it wouldn't shock me right off the bat if there is some level of growing pains with all of these new parts for Colorado trying to mold together in a system that's not the most simplest to learn. And then you're going against a defense in TCU that's got experience both in system and playing together. Over 70% of TCU's defensive production returns. Everything you hear coming out of that camp is guys are far more comfortable in year 2 of Gillespie's 3-3-5 defense. They're playing faster. They're not thinking as much. And that defense by design, right, 3-3-5, it's helped the design, right? It's designed to cover every blade of grass. So the focus of it is speed. So that's interesting to me with that matchup. Ultimately, your main question is, like, can Colorado actually block TCU? And I think that's where the serious question is with Colorado's offensive line. You look at the left tackle, right? GCL, 6% pressure rate allowed on pass block last season, below replacement level. Tyler Brown played at Lafayette and followed Deion to both Jackson State and now Colorado. This is a different level. Van Wells, undersized center. He's a sophomore, low 3-star recruit. Jack Bailey, undersized guard, comes from Kent State, replacement level player in the MAC. Savion Washington at right tackle, Kent State player who followed Sean Lewis to Colorado. Metrically, the best of the bunch, but again, coming from a lower level. And, with all of TCU's versatility on defense, I think they're going to put stress on Colorado's offense, which is still learning and gelling to a new system, to be able to adapt snap to snap. And I think that's going to be a little difficult. I know this was our fear, Todd, in breaking down this game, right? We were actually talking Monday morning as we were recording our last NFL preview about going over 59. And because we expect both offenses to operate at a pretty fast pace. And we elected to not go, and about 45 minutes later, that group Brad's talking about, poof, from 59 to 64. And we've kind of decided to let it go at this point. But you also mentioned the weather, and I think that's something to actually think about, right? We've seen these higher temperatures across the country, and there's some pretty good data in games that are in this area, right? 94 degrees and over, and what that does to wear some teams down, and it does lead to some points. And so ultimately, I think that's what propped that group up, with the pace, with the potential fatigue, with the data there, with games that are very hot, and what it does to total. So, I think we'd rather have the over 59 tick in our hand and figure out what to do with it later, but we ultimately chose to to not join that party or officially start the party.
I'm very curious, guys, as we look at Colorado. We know it's one of the more polarizing teams in the national landscape. You read some of the reports that are coming out from prominent sports books about Shedeur Sanders getting a ton of money to win the Heisman, Colorado getting bet to win the national championship. We know those are mountains going to be way too big to climb for Colorado in year one. But I think what's going to be more fascinating is to see how their power ratings adjust week to week, knowing that the roster, to Brad's point, for starting 22, pretty good overall given where they were before as a program, but that there's not a lot of depth. So if they deal with injuries at some of the key positions, does the market respond favorably? Does the market not respond enough? So it'll be a team worth watching every single week of the regular season. From
I'm also
Fort
hearing
Worth,
Cormani
though,
McLean
will be
might not even
blistering
start.
hot to a venue at Beaver Stadium where West Virginia and Penn State will renew acquaintances for the first time in quite a while. Played under the lights, no whiteout in effect, though, for this particular matchup. And when you look at these two teams, it'll be the first meeting since Penn State joined the Big Ten back in 1993. They met 46 straight seasons from 1947 to 1992. So young college football fans won't understand how important this rivalry was to both programs since they haven't played in quite some time. When we look at Penn State, they finished last year 11-2, going 0-2 against Ohio State and Michigan, but running the table against everybody else. Only Alabama and Georgia have won more games, straight games during the month of September. Penn State, though, if you want to be considered elite, you have to get to the top. And they have no college football playoff appearances despite finishing in the top 10 of the AP poll 4 times since 2016. Meanwhile, West Virginia, 5-7 last year, coming off consecutive losing seasons for the first time since 1976 to 79. West Virginia will be seeking its first win as an underdog of 20-plus points since 1995, the second largest underdog price ever that head coach Neil Brown will encounter since he took over in Morgantown. They were 32.5-point dogs at Oklahoma back in 2019. This game, Penn State, right around 3 touchdown favorites, 20 right now, the consensus, plenty of 20.5 as well. Total down a tick earlier in the week to 50. Payne, I think the first question that when you're handicapping this game you have to look at, Garrett Green takes over as the starting quarterback for West Virginia. The JT Daniels experiment clearly didn't work. There's a reason he's going to play at his 37th stop as he wraps up his college career this year at Rice. But is there enough in a revamped receiving core with an inexperienced quarterback going into hostile territory to keep this Penn State defense honest? Because you look at Penn State at all 3 levels of their stop unit, this arguably may be the best defense that James Franklin has had since he took over in Happy Valley, and Manny Diaz did some pretty special things last year in his first season as DC.
Manny Diaz, great defensive coordinator, not a great head coach. You mentioned Garrett Green, won the quarterback battle. He did play 8 games last season. He started the final few, so he's not a complete unknown. You add his feet to the equation, and he can move, right? I think that's the positive with him. 0.58 expected points added per rush, and he also has some pedigree, right? I mean, he's like an Elite 11 finalist in 2019 in that quarterback crop that had C.J. Stroud and Bryce Young. So he has some talent. I just don't know what's on this offense. I think that's the real concern here. And, Neil Brown said all summer, right, he wanted the quarterback that was going to be most accurate and made good decisions and was willing to push the ball downfield. And everything that I have seen from Green, it's not necessarily his best attributes, right? He wasn't overly accurate, 68% adjusted accuracy. He turned the ball over, right? More than a 5% turnover-worthy play rate. And the reports in camp are like Green has a tendency to locate the defense. So it makes me a little bit nervous, right? And then there's also question marks with like who he's throwing to. Yeah. And the pass catchers are pretty bleak there. And so, I mean, I think that's probably the key against Penn State. Can you make some plays through the air? I know Penn State is transitioning to life without, 2 top pros in their back. Joey Porter Jr. and Brown were picks 32 and 87. But I don't think the Mountaineers' offensive line is going to be able to get much push up front in the ground game. So it's very much going to be what can West Virginia do through the air. I mean, Penn State's front 7, to your point there, Todd, looks fantastic. I mean, it was a group that was top 5 in defensive line yards allowed. Returned most of that front 7. A lot of soon-to-be pros up there. Coaches have raved about the front 7 and their work ethic, basically saying everyone's hungry. And every single workout, it's competition. Lots of like-minded individuals willing to strain together. So I don't think you're getting a ton of push up front. And so to stay within this number, Green has to be a better decision maker, cut down on the turnover-worthy plays. West Virginia's receiver room needs to find someone to emerge. I mean, the top 4 are gone. The guys that were brought in don't appear great on paper. Devin Carter from North Carolina State, 6th season. Never been more than replacement level. We've talked about how barren, right, that NC State receiver group has been over the years. Cortez Braum has some juice, 3-star JUCO guy, didn't flash last season. All the rave has actually been about the 2 freshmen. But it's tough to rely on true freshmen in an opener on the road at Penn State. But Rodney Gallagher, right, 4-star kid, undersized. You like to see the work ethic, put on 14 pounds in his first college offseason. And then you have Traylon Ray, a kid from Tallahassee, who's a nice downfield threat. My understanding is the best pass catcher West Virginia's had in camp is the tight end, Cole Taylor, a guy that couldn't contribute at LSU over 3 seasons. So huge question mark about how efficient Green and the questionable receiver group is and how much they're potentially going to score on Penn State here. So it's not surprising at all to have seen this total dip from 53.5 to as low as we record this morning. Another small wave came in, Chris, at 49.5. And it's actually a larger move than just the points, right? I mean, 52 and obviously 51, really extremely important numbers in the total market.
Brad, how dynamic do you expect Penn State's offense to be right out of the gates? We know about the decorated running backs that they have and how dynamic those 2 guys can be as playmakers, but you read some of the notes coming out of fall camp, it seems like there are some questions about Drew Allar's ability to come out of the gates firing, knowing that Penn State has a relatively soft landing spot as a 3-touchdown favorite here, has games against Delaware, at Illinois before they'll probably really get tested against Iowa in the middle of September. What do we think Penn State does from an offensive standpoint against a West Virginia defense that didn't offer a ton of resistance when they stepped up in class last year, but will James Franklin feel comfortable letting Mike Yurcich take the governor off a young quarterback?
I'm concerned, not only from what I've heard out of fall camp, but just eye test for me with Drew Allar. I'm going to even go back to the Army All-American game where obviously big kid, strong arm, showed it, but accuracy issues. Saw some inconsistency last year, which is to be expected being a freshman in the limited snaps that he got. But what really concerned me was the spring game. I'm a guy who watches 60 of them. And to see the Penn State offense struggle against the second-team defense, and by struggle, I mean get dominated, where Allar just couldn't. They had one scoring drive, and he played a bunch of snaps in that one. That raised my eyebrows. I expect conservative game plan, believe it or not. I'm not letting it wide open. Let's lean on that offensive line. Although they did suffer a recent loss, and Tengwall just retired. He was expected to start at left guard, retired. That's happened in the last day or so for them. But they still have a first-round guy at left tackle, expected to be a first-round pick in Fashanu. The greatest thing about the offense is the 1-2 punch of sophomore running backs, and Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen. That should help Allar. I'm not sure that they have that alpha in the wide receiver room that they've had in recent memory, but we'll see if Lambert Smith can step up. But he's been a good number 2, number 3 guy the last few years. Can he be a number 1, an alpha? They brought in a Kent State transfer there. I haven't been wild. I mean, I know they haven't released a depth chart and there's some secrecy, but just reading the tea leaves, I'm not sure Drew Allar's been head and shoulders above the backup so far in fall camp. So, yeah, I don't expect this offense to hit the ground running, which is another reason a lot of the under money makes sense.
Yeah, that's kind of the feeling I've gotten about Allar, and, everyone thought that I'd be stunned, honestly, if he didn't start game 1, but it doesn't feel like he's gone out there and completely dazzled. You mentioned the Kent State transfer, and I think listening to some of the comments about Dante Cephas, they really believe that he was going to be the guy, and they're talking about him potentially not even being a starter and mired in a group of 4 or 5 receivers fighting for reps and, indirectly called out about, hey, you can flash once or twice a week when you're playing at Kent State. It's a little bit different when you're going against NFL caliber defensive backs every single practice in a program like Penn State. So we'll see if Cephas takes that as a wake-up call and if he's capable of asserting himself there. But to both of your guys' points, understand completely why we've seen under money come in here. Not much movement as far as the side, ping-ponging back between that 20 and 20.5, a game that obviously could come down to the bitter end if you're sitting on a favorite or underdog ticket in that spot. On to Sunday, guys, where we have the marquee game of the weekend, and I don't just say that with lip service here. LSU and Florida State. Florida State finds themselves short underdogs for a game being played at Camping World Stadium in Orlando. LSU a 2.5-point favorite. Total on the game, 56. Camping World Stadium, located 250 miles thereabouts from Tallahassee. Last year's game between these programs was played in New Orleans, about 80 miles from LSU's campus in Baton Rouge. Fourth year in a row, the two head coaches will do battle, albeit with different programs. Last two meetings have been decided by a grand total of 4 points. Florida State and LSU is the only ranked versus ranked matchup, so we know it's going to get a lion's share of the betting handle, especially in the standalone time slot on Sunday night. Excluding 2020, it's the fourth time since 2005 there's only one ranked versus ranked matchup in week one, something that also occurred in 2007, 2015, and 2019. FSU defeated LSU 24-23 last season. They blocked LSU's game-tying extra point as time expired. One of the biggest changes is that both defensive lines have added a lot more reinforcements from the transfer portal. And when you look at the trenches, this is a team in Florida State that we had questions about last year. I think they've answered a lot of those, and you can understand why they're generating some buzz as far as national championship contenders. Florida State 2-17, though, against ranked opponents since the start of 2017, a points per game differential of -16. I know there's a lot of noise in those numbers, but it still is worth mentioning here. Payne, Florida State, one of the most valuable things they did this offseason was re-recruiting some of the difference makers on the defensive side of the ball, most notably Jared Verse, who probably would have been a first-round pick. When you look at Florida State's defensive capabilities against an LSU offense that probably has its most depth at running back, some questions on the offensive line outside of Will Campbell, and we're going to get a new-look Jaden Daniels who bulked up over the offseason to endure a little bit more physical pounding. How does Florida State match up defensively with what we think we're going to see from Brian Kelly and company and Denbrook's offense?
Probably the more even of the matchups when you go unit for unit. It sounds cliche, right? But this side of the ball is going to very much be about the trenches, and I think LSU feels better about its offensive line right now than it did heading into this game last season, and I think Florida State's defensive line feels better than it did heading into this game last season, right? It's who's going to ultimately win that battle. I mean, Will Campbell was a true freshman playing left tackle. Emory Jones hadn't been inserted into the starting lineup at right tackle. Garrett Dellinger, if you remember, was playing center after recovering from an offseason shoulder surgery. He's now playing guard. It was Miles Frazier's first game adjusting from the G5 to P5 level, and then you had starting center Charles Turner, who didn't play in last year's FSU game. So to me, LSU's offensive line far more cohesive now. It's more experienced. You had Jaden Daniels come out and said he thinks the O-line's the hardest working unit on the team. But the same can be said for Florida State's defensive line. You mentioned Jared Verse returning, possibly the first defensive player off the board in next year's draft. It's a big year for him. Fabian Lovett returned, which is a little bit of a surprise. Everything I'm hearing is Verse is far more polished than a season ago. It's why he came back. He's always been a speed power guy. Now he's working on his hands and he's implemented some moves into his game. It was also his first game, right? Quite the bump from Albany to playing on the biggest stage against an SEC elite team. And you also have Patrick Payton, turned himself into a freshman defensive player of the year in the ACC, only played 7 snaps in this game last season. Much stronger now. Quicker off the ball. So I think there's a lot of parts that weren't really 100%, so to speak, in their ability, that you're going to have those guys much closer to that. In this one, FSU went out and added multiple 4-star defensive linemen in the portal. Gilbert Edmond, Braden Fisk, and Darrell Jackson. Let's see if Jackson gets his waiver. But, I mean, Gilbert Edmond played 700 snaps for South Carolina last season. He's the 4th guy in FSU's edge rotation right now. The young guys have developed nicely. You have Joshua Farmer. He's going to be an impact player. Byron Turner has developed, and he's got some juice off the edge. Interior line goes 6 deep, and it's versatile. Yeah, I mean, Fisk and Briggs, if you need them, they can play on the edge in heavy situations and known rundowns. I think when you look at LSU, they couldn't get its natural ground game going last year with its running backs, and that unit's actually beat up a little bit. 2 guys out, a couple other guys banged up. 39 yards on 13 carries. If you strip out Noah Cain's rushing touchdown last year, Cain, Goodwin, and Josh Williams averaged negative 0.19 EPA per rush. I think aside from, the obvious up front, it's about taking Jaden Daniels' first read away, right? He tends to panic if it's not there. And then that panic leads to 2 things, right? Not letting routes develop downfield and taking sacks. Remember that, LSU's offense had one of the 10 most efficient in year 1 of Brian Kelly. It was Jaden Daniels' first game for LSU. So there's a lot of interesting components to this game. If you go back to our SEC preview, we said the knock on Daniels, and the one thing that he had to improve was his aggressiveness. Right? I mean, Daniels' ADOT was 118th among qualifying quarterbacks. A whopping 63% of his throws never exceeded 9 yards. One of the first quotes from Brian Kelly this week. I think with Jaden, what we've tried to do in that development process, think about 7-on-7 every throw. Every throw is 4th down. You got one chance here. Throw a back shoulder to a tight end, even if he's covered. Push the ball vertically. Let's make a play downfield. Last year, every throw was 1st and 10. It was a check down. Look for the easiest completion out there. So just hearing that and what we kind of pinpointed this offseason, I think you get a far more aggressive Jaden Daniels. It's not game 1, right? He knows Mike Denbrock's offense better. He knows protections better. And I think that's where this gets interesting because LSU wants to be more aggressive in the throw game. Florida State was top 10 in explosive pass defense last season, but they brought in a new defensive backs coach in Patrick Surtain. And the first thing he wants to do, play tighter coverage, wants more turnovers. So I think there's an ability for potentially some higher variance plays, right? A couple more explosives from LSU, maybe a turnover or 2. Surtain believes he has the horses to play tighter coverage. You added Fentrell Cypress, the second best DB in the portal. If you've been paying attention, the growth of Azare Thomas has been exponential in fall camp. You have Green, Jones, and Vance, all veterans, all have had fantastic camps. Jerrion Jones will be playing with a wrap on his right hand. Past the trenches and Jaden Daniels getting to his second read and being more aggressive. The 2 factors that come to mind immediately in this one is, can you limit Jaden Daniels' legs? Impossible to completely remove them. But if you look in this matchup, every time Daniels took off last year, he averaged over 1 expected point per rush. Think about that. Every time Jaden Daniels ran the ball in this game last year, it was like an invisible point being added to the scoreboard. So you got to focus on Kalen DeLoach. He's fast, has to be better taking his angles. Shaheem Brown playing that Jamie Robinson safety role has to be smart about the angles he takes because they're fast enough to kind of keep up with Jaden. Florida State's also worked all summer improving the ability of its linebackers and coverage. You have tight end Mason Taylor. I know he's a concern for Adam Fuller. The coverage is not the strength of Tatum Bethune and DJ Lundy. You wonder if FSU is able to stop LSU's traditional ground game with its front, so we see maybe a bigger corner like a Jerrion Jones on the field more, who's FSU's kind of wanted to play in that slot role if he's focused on Mason Taylor. If you can stop the run with your front, all of a sudden we can add another defensive back who's bigger and physical to maybe, give Mason Taylor a little bit more trouble rather than focusing a linebacker on him. But I think those are kind of the key areas of this side of the ball.
It's interesting when you look at LSU and we think about the long history this program has of producing elite wide receivers. I don't see a ton of that on the roster right now. We know Malik Neighbors led the SEC in receptions last year for a wide receiver, finished all fall camp. I mean, he's flashed as a true number 1, but you look elsewhere on the depth chart, Brian Thomas Jr., where a lot is expected, haven't exactly seen him really raise his level of play. We'll see if he's a breakthrough candidate this year. You look at Kyron Lacey, and they're even talking about an Alabama transfer, Aaron Anderson, but nobody that's cut from the same cloth as the Jamar Chases and the Justin Jeffersons of the world. So if Florida State can stop the ground game, should be able to make LSU a little bit more one-dimensional. Now, on the other side of the ball, Brad, when we look, the big news coming out of LSU, of course, was the suspension of Mason Smith. You can be a Florida State fan all you want, but anyone who's a college football fan has to feel this situation has been completely botched, suspending him for a game of this magnitude, putting a lot more pressure on one of LSU's other headliners as far as defensive difference makers, and Harold Perkins, who finished third in sacks last year in the SEC and stuffed the stat sheet, was third in sacks, as I mentioned, first in quarterback hits, first in forced fumbles, fifth in pressures. But LSU defensively matched up against a Florida State offense that, if they're able to protect Jordan Travis, has a lot more weapons in 2023's meeting than what they had last year. And it's not just depth in the backfield, it's in the receiving room, possibly headlined by a perfect complement to Johnny Wilson in Michigan State transfer portal edition Keon Coleman.
So if the LSU offense versus the Florida State defense was even, and I agree with that assessment, I actually favor the Florida State's offense as far as the matchup here. Advantage Florida State because of a couple of key things you just mentioned. Florida State offensively this year, deeper. I think a good word to use is multiple. I expect to see some unique formations, stuff that Florida State hasn't put on tape at any point in the Mike Norvell tenure, and that, formations being tight ends. They haven't been able to, the usage rates for tight ends haven't been there, but now they got a couple of guys that can, through the transfer portal. Kyle Morlock, a D2 transfer, is impressed so far in camp. You got a player in Jaheim Bell that you can put at H-back. You can put him in the backfield. You can line him up at tight end. It's just a type of player that Florida State hasn't had under Norvell. You mentioned at running back. Yeah, they lose one of their top guys, but you still have Trey Benson back, Toa Feely. I like the young guys. And to me, the thing that helps this, on the outside, you mentioned that Keon Coleman was one of the biggest gets post-spring of any player, any position group in the entire country. A kid that's 6'4", 215, line him up opposite of Johnny Wilson, who's 6'7". There's just not a lot of teams in the country that are going to be able to match up with that. And obviously Jordan Travis, we've talked about it ad nauseum. I mean, this is one of the most improved quarterbacks we've ever seen, as far as where he was 3-4 years ago to what he is right now. As good as quarterback as any in the country, a guy that I put more money on to win the Heisman than any of my other Heisman bets. And I think the thing that separates this Florida State team, besides the unique formations and everything, is the line of scrimmage up front, which has been the weakness of this program for the last, I would argue, 5 years. And what do they have coming back? 207 career starts, the most in the history of college football. They're bolstered by transfers. They have quality depth. They can go 8 deep. They're above replacement level. Robert Scott's one of their top offensive linemen at left tackle. There's a multitude of guys there it's a far cry from what they were 3-4 years ago. I can't emphasize, if Jordan Travis is one of the most improved quarterbacks that we've ever seen, I would argue the Florida State offensive line has made as much improvement in that regard. And then the LSU defense, I'm kind of wishy-washy on this group and everything that I've heard so far in fall camp. Defensive front, losing a guy like Mason Smith, who, went out of last year's game on a freak injury celebrating a play, not good, because I just don't think that there's I don't think there's a lot of alphas, like first team all SEC caliber type players up front. I do think they're deeper than what they were a year ago, but none of these guys are wowing me. And the guy that wows you is Harold Perkins, but I'll give you something that I'm a little concerned about. He moves inside. They're giving him more responsibilities. To me, Harold Perkins is such a freak athlete. I don't want this guy. I don't want him thinking too much. Just see ball, go get ball. I mean, you're faster than a lot of the people up front on the offensive side of the ball. Go after the quarterback. I'm a little worried there. They bring in an experienced transfer in Omar Spates, but big difference between production against Pac-12 teams than what I think is going to be an elite Florida State offense. The secondary's dealt with some injuries. They already knew they had a problem there because, they brought in 5 transfers this offseason in the secondary alone. I don't see this LSU defense being much better than last year's defense, while I think the Florida State offense is better than last year. So, again, it comes down to me. I think Florida State's offense has the edge here.
Brad, you mentioned Jordan Travis and everything he's been able to accomplish during his time under Mike Norvell's tutelage. I mean, the good thing for Florida State, because we've talked to Payne so much about this in the past, that if Jordan Travis were to miss time, we know Payne has the utmost confidence in Tate Rodemaker to step into the role and take over should he be called on in a pinch. Final thing on this game, guys, and I'll open it to either of you, so if you both want to weigh in, by all means, go for it. When you look at the number, we haven't seen a whole heck of a lot of movement in terms of the side on this game. Very much the feel of an NFL matchup where odds makers have a very good read, at least initially, on their power ratings, and the market hasn't told them anything different. Every time this game gets to 3, you see a little bit of an appetite for the underdog. Wanted to get your guys' take on the way the market has responded, both side and total, for what will be the marquee game of the opening weekend.
I'll say this. I don't expect too much movement, but a couple of things to keep an eye out on. How does the SEC do in the other marquee games? Does Florida exceed expectations if they go out and beat Utah as a 5-point underdog? And then coincide that, maybe South Carolina exceeds expectations. They win outright as a short underdog. I think if that's the case, people are going to be inclined to, the whole SEC mantra. Maybe that gets us back to 3. I have significant doubts. I was actually a little displeased with the market that we did see 3 earlier in the summer, and it was taken away much earlier than expected because I did want to be on the Florida State side here, but I just don't see too much movement like you outlined, Todd. I mean, this is a game that should be, as far as known commodities, the most, priced accordingly game on the entire board.
Very fair, Brad. Payne, any thoughts on that before we close the book on LSU Florida State?
I think he hit it perfectly. Yeah. Brad did very well. Offense and projection of number.
So, no, it should be a great game to watch. Sunday night, we know that everybody will be...
There was a couple threes earlier this week. Pinnacle was still dealing 3 minus 13. There's a couple other places that had some straggling threes. I think it's very much wait and see.
No. Understand.
I think 3 is a buy.
Yeah, I agree.
I think Brad is very well in tuned with what people are about to see on offense from the Florida State Seminoles.
It'll be there.
Quiet confidence there. Let's just put it that way.
It'll be there on full display Sunday night after a full buffet of college football. This, of course, like we said, the crown jewel, 7:30 Eastern from Orlando, LSU against Florida State. But it is not the final game of college football week 1. We have an ACC showdown between a perennial power in the Clemson Tigers going on the road to Wallace Wade Stadium to take on the Duke Blue Devils. It's the first meeting between these ACC programs since 2018. Duke's last win over Clemson came back in 2004. This will mark Clemson's first trip to Durham since 2012, and Dabo Swinney didn't resist the opportunity to take shots at the Duke layout for exactly how the stadium sets up, saying that the 2 to 3 minute walk it was going to take his team from the visiting locker room was really going to cut into their ability to rest during halftime. When you look at Duke, they're trying to overcome a bit of history, just 130, and they've lost 28 consecutive games versus AP top 10 teams going back to 1980. Their lone win over an AP top 10 team since 1980 came in 1989 when they knocked off a number 7 ranked Clemson team 21-17 at home, 1-15 at home versus AP top 10 teams since 1980. And Brad, I'll come to you first on this game. When you look at just the quarterbacks on paper, one guy has accomplished a heck of a lot more during his short college career than the other. However, the inexperienced player is wearing Clemson colors. Riley Leonard, a name that the casual college football fan may not know, but one who performed exceptionally well at the helm last year when he won the job in fall camp for these Duke Blue Devils.
Yeah, I'll start with Riley Leonard. I think he might be the most underrated quarterback in the entire country. I think he's a legitimate top 15, borderline top 10 quarterback nationally. Did everything for Duke last year. Was an accurate passer, nearly 3,000 passing yards. Took care of the football, only 6 interceptions. I think that the most underrated part of his game is you look at him, you think he's not very athletic, but that wasn't the case. He led the team in with rushing touchdowns with 13 of them. They leaned on him regularly in the run game. So a dual threat kid that shocked the world last year because he wasn't even the favorite to start coming out of spring practice and was still able to do what he did. Obviously, there's a lot more fanfare on the other side. Cade Klubnik was more efficient than Uiagalelei. Still, I mean, if you're looking for Trevor Lawrence to walk through that door, or Deshaun Watson, I don't think he's there yet. But I do expect improvement from him, if one reason only being new offensive coordinator Garrett Riley's a significant upgrade. Now, we'll see. I mean, everyone, including myself, is anointing him as this big upgrade. I mean, you're still talking. He's got the last name, but we'll see if he's and a little bit of pedigree. But to keep in mind, Sonny Dykes still had his hands in that TCU offense last year. I thought it was a good sign that Dabo finally went outside the family, hired a new offensive coordinator. And I think when you look around the weapons surrounding Klubnik, particularly running back Maffa and Shipley, I think they're in a much better position. With that said, I'm similar to the Trevor Lawrence, Deshaun Watson comments. I'm not sure that they have an elite wide receiver. A lot of those elite wide receivers that they had in 2016 and 2018, they're not walking through that door either.
Payne, when you look at this game and try and figure out, what it's going to be like for Duke defensively against some of the players that Brad just highlighted in Clemson's offensive arsenal, I mean, clearly they don't recruit at the same level. I'm not telling our listeners something they don't already know. Clemson's offensive line had some shortcomings in the past, but optimism reigns supreme there that this group can be a little bit better, create some pathways for Cade Klubnik, give him time in the pocket. When you look at Duke's defense, do they have a path to having success, knowing that this is going to be Cade going into hostile territory, even if Clemson fans are surely going to invade that stadium and make it a hell of a lot closer to 50-50 than would be in some other road venues?
I think Brad hit it perfectly, right? I mean, Duke's not going to have a chance unless Riley Leonard's sensational. I think that's quite clear. But I am very much interested about this side of the matchup because it's not just this game, but what we can take from it for the future. And Brad said it perfectly. Everyone is anointing Garrett Riley the number one coordinator in college football. I'm interested to see how improved Clemson's offense is. Where is the pace set? What formations and motions are being used? Let's see if Cade Klubnik in year two actually looks like a five-star quarterback. I mean, we said this in the preview. The sample size was small, but Klubnik wasn't good last season, right? Double the amount of turnover-worthy plays than big-time throws. Adjusted accuracy was 8% worse than the quarterback that was shipped out and is now playing in the Pac-12, right? And you look at Klubnik was a deer in headlights when he was pressured. Big arm, struggled to throw the deep ball. Again, the sample size is small, just 117 dropbacks, but you'd prefer to see obvious signs right away. Clemson does return 4 of 5 up front, and the new guy is Tristan Lee, a former 5-star tackle. Word is the O-line for Clemson's bulked up some. Didn't address receiver in the portal, so it's Randall, it's Turner, it's Williams, it's Collins. Is that good enough to be considered a national title contender? And that's really what this conversation's about, not just Duke, right? I mean, Clemson believes they're a legitimate title contender. And so I think we at least get a glimpse of the receivers, but it's a very tough first test. I mean, you look at this Duke defensive front, you look at Mike Elko, entire offseason to prep. Duke does have 4 all-ACC defensive players. D-line is experienced and arguably the best group on the team. I mean, you have Dwayne Carter, Jamian Franklin, Peebles, Oben, and Nelson. They're all 4th, 5th, 6th-year guys. Carter is the horse inside, just a game wrecker. You pair that experience with some young talent, Vincent Anthony Jr., 4-star kid, top 190 player from the 2022 class. And I think Duke's defensive line is actually one of the better ones in the ACC because of the experience. And you look at the responsibilities, right? All those guys know where they're supposed to be. No one's trying to play hero ball, and it allowed Duke to be top 35 in explosive run defense. You look at how they play. 4-2-5. Excuse me. So their goal is...
Grab some water over there, guy. Don't get choked up on the first regular season podcast of the campaign.
Dying over here. So you look at what they do defensively. It's to keep everything in front, right? Limit explosives. And so Klubnik is going to be forced, in my mind, to move the ball methodically, right? And that's where you can beat Duke, right? They're outside the top 100 in passing success rate allowed. Are Clemson's receivers good enough to consistently get open in those short to intermediate areas? And can Klubnik hit them consistently? I think when we watch the spring game, we're sitting here saying, where's the separation? And I think that's the really interesting thing for me. So as good as Riley is, and as much hype as there is with Klubnik, that duo, needs to come together. And what I'm hearing and what the market's telling us a little bit is that Clemson's defense is going to improve this year, especially in the back end with their coverage.
Yeah.
That's what we're projecting in-house. I think Duke's defense should be able to battle enough up front with their experience and depth, limit the explosiveness. Game could probably be lower scoring than people think, and so it wouldn't shock me if the next move on this total is below that key of 55.
6 games, gentlemen, broken down as extensively as you know how to do. Brad, I think if we set odds on Payne getting choked up with emotion on the first podcast of the season, that would have been about a 15-1 long shot. So that's essentially, a 4.
That's what college football does.
Yeah, apparently so. He's come a long way, Brad. Since you came onto this podcast at the start of last year, Payne has got much more emotional and sentimental when it comes to breaking down some of these games. But before we officially put a bow on the games we've broken down, Brad, wasn't sure if there were any other things that you might be looking for in some of the other contests that our listeners should be paying attention to.
No, I think obviously I would remind people that these lines have been out forever. May. So I would be cautious in that regard. With that being said, I can tell you I will not be cautious in my betting because there's 73 games that aren't lined, including a bunch of games as we're recording this on a Thursday morning. There's a bunch of games that are played tonight that aren't lined and put on the board yet. So those are the games that I expect to have the most value, and that's where my attention will be here at least the next few days.
Always champing at the bit, knowing that there are FCS versus FBS matchups on the horizon, along with FCS versus FCS opponents. You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. And most importantly, as always, you can follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Best bet portion of the program, my friends. It is the first regular season best bet that we are going to offer up around these parts. So, Payne, I know these lines have been up since you were a much younger man 6-8 months ago or thereabouts. But is there any value that still remains, in your expert opinion, on the college football betting board?
It's difficult. I think Brad hit it perfectly in that these lines have been out for a while. They're very much burnt and beat up. I know everyone's looking forward to the first official weekend and they want to dive right in. But this market's been fairly well shaped over this time frame. Don't want to give out anything that's burnt at this point. I'll be honest. I will get the shit since I am the messenger of this.
Here we go. Here we go.
You're
backpedaling already. You're backpedaling already.
You boys behind the scenes have been chomping at the bit for this. And you guys are gung-ho. I was listening to you guys talk about this game. And boy, oh boy, I think it makes a world of sense. Shocking. We're going to go to the biggest game of the week. This is typically not our style. I would have figured you for some Sunbelt action.
Look,
you just didn't deliver.
Look, I came close on a couple. We talked about the other big game total on UNC and South Carolina, where I think you and I share a brain that you're going to look like a genius if the game is played in the 20s, or you look like a bumbling idiot if both teams get to 40 that have the
There's also
capabilities there.
Yeah, there's some numbers there that I think.
Yes, numbers selfishly that we're waiting for, hoping that the market can get to, if we're being completely honest.
Listen, I think Brad hit the breakdown perfectly, right? This is, and we'll just kind of state this. We're going with rotation number 232, Florida State Seminoles, plus the 3 on the bye. I don't think this is going to get there naturally. We believe it'll have a chance to trend closer to pick. That's our belief. Are we usually adamant on buying to 3? No, there's some minus 120, some minus 121 out there. Let's call it playable to minus 125. When you're using this like sniper's approach of one best bet, buying a little bit different than if you're Brad spraying 110 games. I don't think we get to natural 3, and Brad's breakdown of Florida State's offense, I mean, picture perfect, and it kind of instilled some confidence in me because this is the first time Mike Norvell's had weapons that are multiple, and it's going to allow Florida State to disguise better than they ever have and provide answers to things that they are going to see throughout the course of the game. If Florida State wants to spread you out and go 11 and 10 personnel and tempo, no problem. They want to go 12 and 13 formation and play more physical than ever, no problem. Move Bell and Morlock from inline to slot, not an issue. Receiver group, Brad hit perfectly, is massive. They're all willing blockers. You look, I mean, Keon Coleman, 6'4", Johnny Wilson, 6'7", Kentron Portier, 6'3", but they're all quick and fast enough to play much smaller, and I think that's where Florida State's largest edge is in this game. It's going to be in the throw game. It's you think about the cohesion in the back with LSU breaking in all of those new parts, but also the size advantage is interesting. Sage Ryan, whether it be nickel or boundary corner for LSU, which is where he actually worked in their last scrimmage, is 5'11". Greg Brooks Jr., 5'10". Deuce Chestnut, 5'10". Go back to the film last year when Syracuse played FSU. Did not go well for Deuce. Gave up 5 receptions on 6 targets for 2 touchdowns, and Johnny Wilson is much more refined. When you look at LSU in the back, they like to play a cover 3 defense. They want to shut down your short throws. Schematically, LSU was fantastic doing that last season, but they were, not very good defending the throws downfield. They were outside the top 90 in EPA allowed defending 20-plus yard passes, 113th in the country in deep ball touchdown rate allowed. You have Johnny Wilson, who, again, is not the guy you saw in last season. He's much more refined. Averaged 21 yards a catch last year, 3.4 yards per route run. Mason Smith, obviously, right? All the talk, huge loss. My understanding was he wasn't going to get a full snap allotment anyways, was dealing with some nagging injury stuff, but this will allow FSU to focus more attention on Wingo now and Harold Perkins. So I would fully expect Wingo to see 2-man blocks on runs. That's where Wingo's a disruptor. He's not overly great getting to the quarterback, just a 5% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. Intrigued to see what Matt House does with Harold Perkins, and I think Brad said something that I have not heard anywhere, but it's the same thing that I felt. Putting him in the middle of the field in just a linebacker role, and I get you have to account for the legs of Jordan Travis because he's dynamic, but if Perkins is just going to be a statue in the middle of the field spying Jordan Travis waiting to take off, it feels like you're wasting arguably the best disruptor in this game. I think you would have to put Perkins on the edge, see if Robert Scott, who's a below replacement level pass blocker his entire career and has missed most of the offseason with injury, can handle Perkins' speed. I don't really love the pieces here for LSU's defense, and you and I were talking a little bit about the reports that are coming out. Spates, right? He's kind of like the key cog to LSU's defense in the middle. It's a below replacement level at the Pac-12 level. And if you want to really get into the weeds, Derek Ray, who's at Florida State now as the general manager, was at Oregon State. Florida State wanted a linebacker in the transfer portal. They passed on Spates. So I don't necessarily love all of the parts defensively, right? I mean, you lost B.J. Ojulari, you lost Ali Gay. There's a couple other guys you lost inside. I don't know if they've been replaced. So I think this is the best way. I think Florida State's offense shows pretty well here, Todd.
Look, it's a massive game for two teams that have eyes on not only conference titles, but getting to the college football playoff. And I think when you look at Norvell's track record against Brian Kelly, it's hard to ignore. We've seen him do more with less over the last couple of seasons. No strangers to one another here. And, Brad mentioned it, talked about Jordan Travis being a guy that he's heavily invested in the Heisman Trophy Award. No greater stage than to take full advantage when all eyes in the college football world are on them Sunday evening from Camping World in Orlando. To your point, these numbers have been up for an eternity. It's rare for us to find the single biggest game of the first weekend. But look, there can be some inefficiency that's created, a little bit of public perception factoring in here. And quite frankly, while the number on the surface may seem correct, when you take all of the things that you factor into arriving at a bet, especially with that sniper-like approach, I think Florida State deserves to be a short favorite here. So being able to take 3 on the buy at minus $1.20 up to $1.25 makes a world of sense. Anything
for full disclosure, I actually shot Brad a note, and you can tell our listeners this because I know you guys like to play the game about Florida State guy, but I always try to ask you guys questions to get the response back. And one that I asked Brad last night via text was, what's your vibe from LSU's camp? And what is your vibe from Florida State's camp? And he's like, the vibe that I get from LSU's camp is not great, right? Lots of infighting. Florida State, meanwhile, it's just been this business tactical approach. You would think with bringing in a transfer, right, like Keon Coleman, who could have went to Ole Miss, been the dude in a pass-happy offense for a team that's probably going to be playing behind some, and he chose to come to Florida State. And he's been candid. I want to be out of here in 4 months. I want to be a top 38 pick in the draft. He's been like one of the best team guys possible. And I think Mike Norvell came out and said, as kind of a jab to some of the other Florida schools, because Miami has taken 27 transfers, now 28 with Burrows, by the way, who knocked out his coach at Alabama, and he's somehow going to be on the roster this year. That's 28. Florida State's taken 26, and Norvell's point was, we don't just take transfers, we take the right ones. And all of the guys have seemed to come in and been cohesive, and the camp has been the best that we've seen in Mike Norvell's tenure.
Let's be honest here, Payne.
Yeah.
You're going to be glued to the edge of your seat watching this game, regardless of best bet territory. I'm not even going to pay attention. I got a fantasy draft that's going to take priority over all of this. It's going to carry me through the first half with bragging rights on the line there with some familiar names in our space. So, I expect...
Yeah, Scott Van Pelt still kicking your ass there,
I can post the records. Best league record for an original member produced by yours truly around those parts. And so I'll check the score at halftime. Florida State will be up 42-3, and I'm not even going to have to watch a second half. I can go back to watching my beloved NASCAR.
People will actually think you're serious about that score prediction.
No, it's not. It's going to be 24-3. I reversed the numbers instead of 42-3. So,
all right, let's.
All right. Anything else you want to share? Do you have any special Labor Day weekend plans, or are you already fully immersed? Because this is peak season for us.
No, we got some work to do here. We've been away from the market for about 2.5, 3 hours now, recording and talking with Brad off air and doing all that good stuff. So let's get out of here so I can get some work done. Go
get some work done. All right, for all of you loyal listeners, thanks as always for tuning in. Special thanks to Payne, Brad Powers, and the talented team behind the scenes, or the one-man show that makes Bet the Board go. Best of luck with all of your week one investments. I can't remind all of you guys enough. It is a marathon, not a sprint. These numbers have been up for a long time, and the likes of Brad Powers have been picking them apart for months. You'll have a lot more volatility and hopefully opportunity that comes along with it week 2 when we get at least one data point for some of the marquee programs. But most importantly, with a Florida State ticket in hand come Sunday evening on the holiday weekend, we'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.